Somebody left their glasses here. They'll be there when you come back in. Cole, thank you so much. Oh, I had no idea that was your first time to do the children's story when I asked you. So over lunch, he's all going to explain to us how he did that trick, aren't you, Cole? And visitors, please do stay and join us for lunch in our hall next door afterwards. We would love to have your company and to get to know you a little bit better. We have two very special ladies from our congregation who are in hospital at the moment. One is Cole's wife, Val, and the other is Jenny Ray. And I would like you to uphold those two ladies in prayer as you have your family devotions this week and you pray for our church. Please pray for Val and Jenny, who are both not well at the moment. Righto, Uncle Rich, if I can have my first slide, that would be terrific. Who knows what this is? Has anybody seen this before? Nobody's been there. This is Devil's Tower Monument in Wyoming National Park in North America. And it's a monolith of a structure that stands more than 1,200 feet high from its surrounding area. That's about 360 odd metres high. So approximately half the height, or a little bit more than half the height of Mount Archer. At its circumference around the base, it's 1.6 kilometres or a mile around. And there is a legend amongst the local Indian people that one of the names of this, one of the local tribal Indian names for this monolith is Tree Rock. Now, what does that look like to you? What does it look like to you? It looks like a tree stump, doesn't it? And there are some people, a very small minority of the world's population, it's true, but there are some people who speculate this might be a, what's the word? Yeah, there's a special word for it. Petrified tree stump. Now, the Indian legend that goes with it is that the tree roots of this stump go out right around what they know as the earth, which would have been all of North America. And that every other tree that you see is tapped into the root system of that giant tree stump. Now this is legend, I know, but just filter it through your experience. If this was a tree stump at its current height that you can see there and the size of the base, the tree would have reached over 18,000 feet. That's 5.5 kilometres in the sky. If it is a petrified tree stump, that's one huge tree. And of course our story today, we're focusing on Daniel 4 and 5, and of course Daniel chapter 4 brings to us the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of an enormous tree that fills the earth. And the Indian legend says that the top of the tree just went on forever and ever. In other words, they never saw the end of it. That's how big it was. If it was 5 kilometres high, that would be a pretty good description. They just thought it extended forever. And to them, it represents the tree of life, because every other tree gets its life from its roots. Of course, trees are a part of our everyday life, aren't they? We are surrounded by them. If you want to take a little drive up Mount Archer, up the hill towards Mount Archer or some of the steeper hills in Frenchville, you get to the height of about the treetops, the city disappears under a blanket of trees. It's only when you get a little bit higher again that you can actually see the buildings in amongst the trees. Trees occupy 1/3 of the land area of our planet. Trees are the lungs of our planet. They are the plants that produce the oxygen that nearly every other life form depends upon. 80% of the world's biodiversity lives within forests. If we did not have forests, we would not have life on this planet. So we're continuing our series on the book of Daniel, and I'm taking you now to that story in Daniel chapter 4 of the giant tree. And providentially, this also was the children's Sabbath school lesson this week as well. And so I've entitled my sermon this morning, A Right Royal Response. Because it's the story, chapters 4 and 5, is the story of how two people respond to the living God. And thanks, Cole, it's the story of Dan and Bel. That's exactly what it is. And it's how those two kings responded to this God moving in their midst and moving in their world. And of course, we have been here journeying through the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is a book about judgment, isn't it? Daniel's name means God is my judge. And in nearly every chapter, judgment is the theme that flows through. How people respond to God is evident in every chapter. And if you remember back a month or so ago when I did the introduction to this series, when we looked at chapter 1, I said to you, all of the major themes of this book are in chapter 1. And we learnt that even though empires are judged in this book, so too are individuals. And that it's individuals who make up empires. It's individuals who rule over these empires. And it's the influence that they can have upon their kingdoms and the influence that God can have upon their kingdoms that is the major theme of this book. And of course, those themes that I introduced you to in chapter 1 are played out in the very lives and experiences of Neb and Bel. Well, we open the story. The book is telling us that God is the one who is in control of events on this world. The very first verse of the very first chapter of this book tells us that God handed over the people of Judah to Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. God was the one who handed them over. We learn in this book that wisdom is a God-given gift. And once again, in these chapters, it is Daniel's ability to interpret dreams and have wisdom that is heavenly that enables him to explain what these visions are to the monarchs that he stands before. In chapter 1, we learn that the temple articles are taken as booty of war back to Babylon, and it's in chapter 5 that Belshazzar's wild party actually uses those very temple articles. In other words, God's temple is being attacked right through this book. And so judgment now comes down to two people, two men who have an opportunity to respond. And it is a right royal response. And they are contrasting responses. One man finally humbles himself before the God of the universe. The other man sets himself up against God right until his dying breath. And so if we come to chapter 4 this morning, we encounter the story that is actually Nebuchadnezzar's own personal testimony. That's what it is. And Nebuchadnezzar begins by writing a letter. So here's the words of a once pagan king that are included in the very pages of the Hebrew Bible, written in Aramaic, written in his own hand. And he has a testimony to share. And it reminds me, just this week I was reading through Mark's Gospel, where Jesus meets the demoniac living in the tombs. And when he cures them of all the demons that are inside, drives them out, the man wants to follow Jesus and his disciples and learn of Jesus. And Jesus turns him back and says, no, you go home and tell how much the Lord has done for you. And that's what this story is. Nebuchadnezzar is telling how much God has done for him. And so he opens the letter in chapter 4 It is King Nebuchadnezzar to the peoples, nations and men of every language who live in all the world. He wants everyone to know about his experience, his personal experience. And it's a letter that's applicable to all ages. It's his testimony that can be read by humanity anywhere in the world at any point in history. This is the testimony of the most powerful man in the world in his generation. Shouldn't that get our attention? It should, shouldn't it? And so we learn that Nebuchadnezzar is content and prosperous there in the great city of Babylon, that he had a lot to do with planning and constructing and seeing built up with the amazing amount of wealth that his kingdom had. But he has a dream, and his dream frightens him. His dream made him afraid. If a dream makes someone afraid, it can only be because it is bad news. When I say bad news, it's a portent of something that's yet to happen in the future, and he doesn't feel comfortable about it because he knows it's a judgment upon him. As we learnt at the end of chapter 1, judgment was held upon the young boys who had finished their university training. And it was at the end of the days of their training that judgment was held. And now it's at the end of days that judgment is held upon Neb and Bel. And so he calls in his wise men and he relates the dream to them, slightly different from chapter 2, in which he asks them to relate the dream to him. This time he knows they're not up to it, so he tells them the dream. But still these guys are not up to the task. They've finished their party tricks, Cole, but they can't do the job that they should be doing, the real job that they're there for. And finally Daniel comes into his presence. We don't know if he was summoned or if he just heard the commotion and came to find out what all the noise was about. But we read in verse 8 that Daniel comes into the king's presence, at which time Nebuchadnezzar basically says, Daniel, am I glad to see you? And he tells Daniel the meaning of the dream. He tells Daniel the dream that he saw. And it's an enormous tree that fills the whole earth. Was it one of those trees like that tree stump that we saw in Wyoming? Was it that big? Because it filled the whole earth. And all the creatures of the world found shelter and food under this tree. But a messenger comes down, and Nebuchadnezzar refers to it as a holy messenger, comes down and says, cut down the tree. In other words, judgment is pronounced. Cut down the tree. Whom is he talking to? Who is to cut down the tree? He doesn't answer that question. We can only assume that it is God himself that is going to humble this proud monarch. But there is hope even in this message, because Nebuchadnezzar hears that the stump of the tree is to remain, bound with a band of bronze and iron, to keep the stump from drying out and splitting and opening up and the elements getting in. It is bound tight. It sounds like it's there to be preserved for a future time. Have any of you ever noticed this tree stump driving down to Gingin? It's on the Bruce Highway. If you flash past, there's an intersection that goes off to the right. I think it's a dirt road. If you flash past it and keep your eyes forward, you'll miss it completely. But here is an old, dry, dead tree stump, flipped on its top, and out of the centre of it is growing new growth. There is new life even in that once dead tree stump. And I can only just imagine, it's been there for a number of years now, I can only just imagine that stump has now actually reversed, put some roots down into the ground, and this new tree is starting to sprout again. There is yet life in this stump in the story of Nebuchadnezzar. there is yet hope for him. There is some conditionality upon it. But at this point in the vision, it goes from talking about an inanimate object, a tree, to, it says, let him, first person, singular masculine, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with animals among the plants of the earth, and let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal. What separates humanity from the animal kingdom? Some of you are saying our consciousness, choice. What separates your mind from the animal kingdom? Because evolutionists will tell you that you're nothing more than the product of a biological process that has taken several million years. And you're just a higher form of life on this planet that Homo sapiens have evolved to a higher plane than any other creature on this earth. Is that what you think about yourself? We are made in the image of God. So what is it about your minds that separates you from the animal kingdom? Can I suggest it's a consciousness of the divine. It's a consciousness of God. No other species on this planet has the capacity in its brain to contemplate and appreciate the things that you and I can. Otherwise, we're nothing more than just animals, and we might as well just behave like animals. But the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is being called to judgment here tells us that there is a God who has a standard, and life is more than just obeying the impulses or the instincts that drive your physical being. Our lives are governed by the law of God. Nebuchadnezzar is told that he will have the mind of an animal for 7 times, or 7 seasons, or 7 years. And some of you may be asking the question, is that literal? Well, yes, it is. Usually in the Bible, when a time period is given to an individual, it's nearly always literal. When it's used of kingdoms, in other prophecy, in the book of Daniel, it is given in the same language, but it is used symbolically. But when it applies to individuals, it is literal time. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be insane for 7 years. The angel finishes the description that Nebuchadnezzar sees. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. What did Nebuchadnezzar think of himself? He thought he was God on earth, that he had the power of life and death over any living thing within his empire. He believed he was God. But he had a valuable lesson to learn, that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of this world, and he gives them to anyone he wishes. Well, once Daniel hears the dream, he knows immediately who it applies to, and he's troubled to tell the meaning. And the king says, "Don't withhold the meaning from me." And Daniel says, "If only this dream applied to your enemies. But the massive tree that you saw that fills the whole earth, that everything under it receives life from, you, O king, are that tree." Just as in the previous vision, Daniel had said to him, "You are that head of gold." In the image in chapter 2, Here he can tell him, you are that tree. That tree represents you. And he says all the creatures under the earth find their existence within your dominion. But a pronouncement has been made upon you. Judgment has been made upon you, and the tree will be cut down. That sounds like judgment, doesn't it? If you're a tree growing up in the forest, and if you had consciousness, and you heard the footsteps of the woodsman coming through swinging his axe, you know it's judgment day, because you're about to lose your foothold on life. It's judgment day upon the king. But the promise is there that the stump will be bound with iron and brass to preserve it. And then Daniel can give that explanation. 7 times will pass by until you acknowledge the Most High as sovereign over the kingdoms of men. And finally, your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. And this has been Nebuchadnezzar's challenge all along. God has been wooing this pagan king. From the very first chapter of the book, God has been wooing this pagan king. But it's a conditional prophecy, because Daniel says to him, but if you renounce your sinful ways and your oppression of the poor, and you start to behave like a monarch should, perhaps even then, judgment can be delayed or put off. Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't take this to heart, and God in his mercy allows a whole 12 months to go by. It isn't instant. He is given time to process the dream that he's had. He's been given time to process the interpretation that Daniel has given. 12 months go by. And then one day he's standing on the roof of his palace and he says, is this not the great Babylon that I have built? And we read that immediately after what he had said this, immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven from people, and he ate grass like a cow, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, and his hair grew like feathers, and he had nails like the claws of a bird. And then finally, at the end of that time, at the end of days, there's that phrase again, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Can I suggest to you that his sanity was restored before he raised his eyes towards heaven? And God in his providence had set a time of 7 years. And I can just imagine that Daniel was somewhere behind the scene making sure that the affairs of government, that the affairs of the empire were all in hand, were all taken care of, because Daniel knew that this period of insanity was only going to last 7 years. And finally we read that his nobles actually came and sought him out. They came looking for him with the nail scissors and the barber's clippers. Because Daniel had told them he'll just be absent-minded for about 7 years, then he'll come back. And finally he acknowledges that God's dominion is an eternal dominion. The chapter closes with Nebuchadnezzar saying this statement, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. And if you want to know what he means by that, it launches straight into the next chapter. And of course there are no chapters in the original writings, and straight away we get the story of a man who could not humble himself before God. And of course we're talking about King Belshazzar. Belshazzar brings out, in defiance of all that he knows, he brings out those temple vessels. and he fills them with alcohol and he shares them around his party. He knows the origin of these things. He knows he is desecrating something that has been dedicated to a holy purpose, to a sacred purpose, to a religious purpose. By drinking out of them, he is mocking the God of the Hebrews. And while in their drunken stupor, they praise the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. He's almost praising the very idols, or the very idol that was depicted in chapter 2. Lifeless idols that require human intervention to even manufacture them in the first place and even move them around in the second place. And then we get the writing on the wall. And it's a term that we use in popular culture today. We still say about so-and-so or such and such, and the writing was on the wall. And what do we mean by that? That the consequences are inevitable. You're going to have to face up to the results of your actions. And so when we say, oh yeah, couldn't you see that coming? The writing was on the wall there. It was obvious to everyone that the course that Belshazzar was pursuing was in defiance of the God of heaven. And Cole very well told the children about Bel and his wobbly knees. And Daniel finally gets called in. The Queen Mother arrives first and reminds him of the one man in the kingdom who could interpret such a thing, because all the other guys are just show ponies. And once again, the wise men have shown themselves up for who they really are. And Daniel is called in once again. And Daniel, the very first thing he does is remind him of Nebuchadnezzar's own personal testimony, Nebuchadnezzar's own personal story. Remember your predecessor? He set himself up against the God of heaven. Remember what happened to him? You knew all this. You've known his personal testimony. You've known from the highest ruler of the land, who through his experience in life came to understand that the most important thing a human being can acknowledge is that God is sovereign over all of our lives. And you knew all this, Belshazzar, and still you set yourself up against the God of heaven. You have not humbled yourself. Even though God holds your very life in his hands, you have not humbled yourself. And so now your days are numbered. And I think Daniel had more of an understanding of this than we realise. Because he, as I shared with you a month or so ago, he grew up in Jerusalem, hearing the preaching of the prophet Jeremiah. And there in Jeremiah, he read that the nation of Judah would serve the kingdom of Babylon for 70 years. And in Jeremiah 27, we read that all the nations will serve. I'll come back up a little bit. Now I will hand all your countries over to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time of his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him or his empire. Daniel knew that time was up for the kingdom of Babylon. Belshazzar was weighed and found wanting, and judgment was pronounced and executed that very night. There was no 12 months of probation for Belshazzar. When I think about this story and about these two men and how they responded to the evidence that was given before them of how God had ruled in the lives of his people, how God was in control of the affairs of nations, how God could deliver 3 men out of a fiery furnace. Belshazzar would have grown up with that story. He was probably a little boy when it happened. New Testament writers are very clear that all of us will one day face judgment. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, we read that, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad." Because life is a series of choices. And as we have looked at the characters in the book of Daniel, at different stages in their life, they are faced with critical choices that have eternal consequences. When you think about it, every single choice we make in life has eternal consequences, for good or for bad. And every character is faced with that choice. And here this morning, we have looked at the royal choice that these two men have made. And they made a right royal choice. One made a choice for life, and the other made a choice that led to death. And we can look at a story like this. And Jeff shared our scripture passage this morning. The parable Jesus told of the rich fool who had everything he needed. He could put his feet up for a number of years and not even have to lift a finger because he had so much abundance stored away. And God said to him, "Fool, this very night your life will be required of you." Each and every one of us will be faced with a choice to make in our lives. And it may come at a critical time in our lives. It may even just be an everyday experience in our lives. But we will be faced with a choice in which we have the opportunity to acknowledge that God is sovereign over our lives, and we can submit ourselves to this sovereign King. We can choose the path to reject or rebel against this God, but ultimately we will have to live with the consequences of our choice. You see, judgment is good news. Judgment and the gospel go hand in hand. The gospel means good news, and judgment is good news. Because the gospel without judgment is only half the story. Our lives here on this planet, 70 or more if we're lucky, our lives here on this planet are for us to come to the appreciation, come to the realisation that life is not about number one. Life is not about uno numero. Life is not about myself. Life is not about my ego. Life is about God and what God can do in my life and what God can do in your life, even as He can use me to serve you. A few weeks ago, we were studying the Sabbath school lesson with our young people out the back room. And I said, life is a series of choices, but it begins right at the very earliest years of our life. And as we develop, we learn that there's more to the world than just myself. By the time we're into our adolescent years, we realise there's more to life than just my needs. There are other people out there as well. And some people never get past that childhood appreciation of life. They get to adulthood and they still think it's all about them. And so we face a series of choices in our life. And one day we will have to live with the consequences of those choices. And that's good news, because it holds each and every one of us accountable to the very God who holds our life in His hands. And one day He's going to ask each of us, just as Nebuchadnezzar called the young men into his presence at the end of days, he examined them to see how their university education has gone. At the end of days, God is going to step into human history and say, what have you learned about life from your 70 here? What have you learned about life from your 20 years on this planet, from your 30 years on this planet, from your 40 years on this planet? How much more time do you need to realise that life is not about you, but it's about a relationship with me who made this planet, who made this world, and has given everything life? judgment is good news. It gives us hope, it gives us a future, and it gives us something to live for. Well, the other half of the gospel also tells us that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That is the gospel. And you need to leave this place here this morning knowing that there is no condemnation for you who are in Christ Jesus, and that you can face the judgment with joy because perfect love drives out all fear. May God bless you this morning.